Hello. World War I left a pretty sour taste in the mouth of many Americans as well as Europeans. That's including the British, the French, and the Germans. Now, what would become the aftermath is known in the 1920s and 30s. Now, you probably have heard of references, for example, the Roaring Twenties, which certainly leads many to believe that the 20s were a pretty good period of time to be living in. Why it's called the Roaring Twenties, we'll get into, but what I'm here to talk about is that the 20s and 30s really weren't that fantastic of a time. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. What would come immediately after World War One? Certainly, many of these countries are going to have to rebuild. They're going to have to come to grips that millions of people had perished, and an entire generation had pretty much been wiped out through the course of the war. And that's going from military but also civilian deaths. Now, what came after World War One is, of course, the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, which we'll get into in a second. But first, I wanted to address the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a construct under President Wilson, and he advocated this idea before certainly the United States entered the war, but after the war is when he actually was trying to articulate the League of Nations into an organization. Basically, the League of Nations would hopefully give every country an open forum, an open discussion, mediation, so problems like World War One and war, in fact, would hopefully end. Of course, since then, we're fully aware that that did not happen. But the problems with League of Nations is that, one, it did not have a leader. Part of the problem was, yes, it was passed, it was formed, and many European countries are going to be members of this new League of Nations. However, the United States is not going to join the League of Nations. This is in part due to the shift in American politics. While Woodrow Wilson was in office, he would lose much of Congress to the Republican Party due to the fact many people were tired of the war. They really didn't want America to be in charge of the world and really basically be the policeman and have a bigger role in the world. So the Republican Party was going to be voted into Congress. And so when Woodrow Wilson came back from the peace negotiations, he did not have Congress on his side. And he made some quite abrupt blunders to more or less piss off the Republican Party. So that didn't help things either. So the League of Nations portion of this peace treaty is not going to pass. In fact, the United States makes a separate peace treaty with Germany and the other Axis or Central Powers of World War One. So already the League of Nations, its main advocate, the Americans under Woodrow Wilson, is not going to pass in the United States Congress. They are not going to be part of the League of Nations. Therefore, the League of Nations does not have a leader. Also, one of the problems of this League of Nations is that it was very slow to act. Everything was voluntary. You didn't have any sort of overarching control. And so as a result, if war was to break out or there was a dispute between two countries, it was completely voluntarily for these countries to negotiate, to come to the League of Nations, work through these processes. If one country didn't like what was going on, they could just leave. There wasn't any sort of repercussions. You didn't have any economic sanctions. You didn't have powers willing to go to war or really threatening to go to war. After World War One, much of the population, as well as land mass and resources, have been devastated. So many countries weren't willing to go to war, threaten war after World War One to conduct any sort of peacekeeping operations. So for the most part, the League of Nations was slow to act, it was unwilling to act, and for the most part, it didn't do anything. It didn't really have any teeth to enforce any sort of decrees or acts that the League of Nations was going to pass. Now, the League of Nations do advocate that war is bad, that it shouldn't happen, and certain agreements do occur to ban war, but of course that never actually comes to fruition. It's more propaganda and politics. So, in the 1930s and certainly in the 1940s, when the Italians, the Greeks, the Japanese, the Germans start to expand their power, have disputes over land, start using force or threatening force, the League of Nations really just stands to the side and does nothing. Now, as far as the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, generally, the Treaty of Versailles is going to, first off, force Germany to admit that they started the war. Also, they are going to have to pay back money to compensate the rest of the countries who were involved in the war for their losses. Eventually, that's going to come down to $33 billion in reparation amount. So that's the first phase. They also, Germany, cannot have an army more than 100,000 troops, and they cannot have an air force, they cannot have tanks, they can have a very small navy. So they pretty much made it that they could not defend themselves in the modern era. 100,000 troops is not enough to conduct a war. This is the peace treaty that they agreed to. Now, initially, the Germans, when they agreed to a peace, they thought that they were going to get some benefits out of this peace treaty. They thought that Wilson would be able to convince the other Allied powers to be more lenient on Germany. However, once it was apparent that Wilson did not have any power in his own country, everyone else pretty much cast those notions aside and started ripping Germany to pieces. So, first off, with Germany. Now, we'll deal with the economic situation. Certainly with Germany, we're going to have Hitler coming to power, but that's going to be later in the 30s. So, Germany at this point owes $33 billion. It makes its first payment in 1921. The war ends in 1918, so it does take a few years to get their finances under control. They make their first payment, but in 1922, they claim they are unable to make the payments. The reason being is they owed a lot of debt. They also had to rebuild Germany, its infrastructure, the factories, manufactured goods, and they had to sell them on the open market. And that wasn't going well. So in 1922, unsurprisingly, they were unable to make these payments. And so what France does is they occupy the Ruhr mines and factories in the Ruhr in Germany. That is the most prosperous and economic force in Germany. This is where they get most of their ironworks. They can manufacture weapons. They can manufacture certainly iron and steel that would make it able to produce manufactured goods to sell abroad. The Ruhr mines and factories are very important to Germany and its economic stability. So they were going to take over these mines and factories to compensate for their loss in payments. They're going to run the mines, they're going to manufacture goods, and they will profit off of these goods, and then eventually, when their portion of the payment is paid, they will give them back. Germany, in response, really can't do anything. They don't have an army, they don't want to go to war, and so as a result, they try to battle this financial catastrophe by printing more money, which causes massive inflation. So for example, in 1914, $1 American dollar equaled 4.2 marks, Deutschmarks. 1923, you would need 4.2 trillion marks to equal $1. Their economic situation was a disaster. Basically, you saw a return of a barter system, people trading food, for example, for items. Eventually, France is going to realize that this is not working. In fact, the occupation cost more than they were getting out of the Ruhr mines. They had to pay the troops, supply the troops of food and weapons and everything else that they would need to run these mines. It was far more expensive, and so they would leave shortly afterwards. The Americans, and they are going to leave in 1923, mind you. The Americans, on the other hand, they decide to try remedy the situation. Um, this is going to be called the Dawes Plan, and this is going to begin August of 1924. It was a $200 million loan for the Germans to recover their economy. They planned to stabilize German payments. And it's called the Dawes Plan because it was Dawes, the banker, that organized this whole idea. And so with that, the German currency stabilizes. They are able to make steady payments. They are smaller payments, but these $200 million are used for investments by Americans in German products, also to rebuild German factories, infrastructure, and basically put it on a level footing so they can actually use their economy and factories and mines to pay off their debt and make products. So, with that, now Germany is on the road to recovery, and this is from 1924 onward. Just turning to the Soviet Union for a little bit, in 1917 they had their revolution. This is the Communist Revolution. This brought them out of World War One. So in the later portion of World War One, Russia, which now is going to be called the Soviet Union, is trying to sort out its own affairs. Eventually, by 1924, the Soviets have a stabilized government. This is under Lenin. And what Lenin, as well as the Communist Party, was doing in the Soviet Union was calling on people, basically the lower class, to revolt against their own countries. So in this case, the Americans, the British, the French, the Germans, every single country around the world, they were trying to get people to revolt and be part of the communist movement. Now, part of the problem, of course, is when you instigate or try to instigate revolutions in other countries, they usually don't like you very much. So the Soviet Union is completely isolated from this point. And the Americans, the British, the French, even the Germans don't care for the Soviets. They're trying to cause revolution to change the political scene in each of these countries. The Soviets also have an understanding that there is no worship of God. So that certainly is an affront to many groups of people throughout Europe as well as the United States. And so the Soviet Union is seen as a very violent arm, and they really don't care for the Soviet Union. By 1924, however, the Western nations realized the Soviet Union was around to stay. The Soviet Union did not collapse under a new government. The Soviet Union realized that revolution wasn't going to spread abroad throughout Europe as well as Asia, and so then peace treaties were made between the Europeans and the Soviet Union. The United States is not going to partake in this. This is going to come much, much later, 1933, but we'll get to that in a minute. All right, the next major event that happened during the 1920s and 30s is the Great Depression. But before I get there, we have the concept of the Roaring Twenties. And it's viewed as great economic wealth, a period of cultural experimentation. You have jazz, you have the flappers, and so in America, this is true. The economy was doing very well after World War One, but that's because they had been building a lot of the weapons, a lot of the equipment used in World War One. Their infrastructure was not bombed or destroyed by foreign powers. They were not touched by any sort of foreign weapon by any means. And so their entire country was intact. And so the end of World War One, they are probably the most powerful economic force in the world. However, the British, the French, the Germans, the Austrians, and the Russians, their territory had been bombed, their roads had been destroyed, the railroads had been destroyed, much of their populations had been killed or injured, and they were all bankrupt. This includes Britain. Britain was the most powerful economic force prior to World War One, but after World War One, they accrued a huge debt and credit to America. The United States was selling equipment to the British and the French wholesale. So they owed a lot of money to the United States, and so did many other countries. And then you add in the $200 million loan to Germany, which is going to have to pay off too. There's a lot of money flowing into the United States from these debts accrued by other countries. The United States is also going to have a lot of profit by manufacturing, certainly concrete, building materials, and being able to ship them to Europe. So a lot of people are buying products from the United States, either to rebuild their countries, get lost goods, household amenities, so on and so forth. So in the 1920s, the economy is going very well for the United States. However, for the rest of these nations, the economy isn't doing so well because they're going to have to pay off all this debt. All right, now we have the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression, some of the reasons why it was caused. Certainly, the United States had a huge economic boom after World War One, but the transition from wartime production to a peacetime production did not happen smoothly. Essentially, the farmers were still growing a lot of food. Many of the factories were producing a lot of items, and they didn't scale it down very quickly. So there was a huge overproduction of food as well as manufactured goods. What this causes is the price to go down for a lot of these items. And if you're a farmer, you have your crops, you're not going to sell, whether it be wheat or corn or any other sort of farming good, they're not going to sell for a big price. And so as a result, you're not going to have a lot of money in your pocket, not a whole lot of disposable income. And this happens to a lot of factories as well. So a lot of people lose their jobs just because the farmers don't need them, because you don't have a war going on. And a lot of factories release a lot of these workers because you don't need a lot of these workers there either. So you have all these goods out there, but now you need to sell them. And much of the people in the United States had the goods they needed, but the people who needed goods is in Europe. But they don't have any money because they're bankrupt and they don't have a lot of disposable income to buy the products from America. Also, Europe is paying off their debt, so they're not going to buy a lot of goods from America or anywhere else for that matter because of the debt. So you have a huge decrease in demand. You have debt going on all over Europe. What happens is there's a huge wealth gap. You have a few select very wealthy people, but a lot of very poor, lower class and middle class individuals. So the people just don't have the money to buy these products. So you have a lot of debt, nobody can pay the debt, and you have not a whole lot of disposable income out there because nobody's buying the goods. So as a result of these combining factors, you get the Great Depression. So the stock market is going to crash in 1929 on October. Part of this was initiated by the British raising interest rates to try and encourage investors to come back and invest in British goods. But that causes a lot of people to panic. So they start selling a lot of their stocks on Wall Street, bringing money out of the European sector. So the investors in America who had invested in Germany or Britain or France are now pulling their money out. So that is going to cause a depression in Europe. On October 29, 1929, the great crash of the stock market occurs. In about 2 months, stockholders lost about $40 billion. And this is going to start the Great Depression. By 1930, just a year later, 4 million people are unemployed. 2 years after that, 12 million people are going to be unemployed. So, huge amounts of unemployment. In some areas, you're seeing 25% unemployment, in others, 40 to 50% unemployment. A lot of banks are going to close. People are going to lose their entire savings here in the United States as well as abroad. And then population is going to decline as people starve, and also people aren't interested in creating families because of the economic climate. Now, there were two philosophies at this period of time. There's this philosophy that if you have a free enterprise system, free trade system, the economy is going to work itself out. And that was generally the period of time we're talking about. In the 1920s and 30s, most people thought that the economy would work itself out. There was a belief that the governments did not control the economy. Basically, supply and demand would work itself out. It would level off after maybe a year or two, and then things would go back to normal. The other part of this is advocated by a British economist, Dr. Keyes, and he believed that if you, in the modern economy, reduced demand isn't going to fix the economy like what happened in the Great Depression. Instead, what you had to do was create demand, and using government money, you would have public works projects go out, and they would try to build roads, build dams, or other public projects, and that would give people jobs, and then there would be a demand of building supplies as well as other different products, and then this demand would at least slow down the economic depression and potentially bring it back up. His policies were largely ignored. Now, President Hoover in the United States, he is going to come about with the idea that the economy is going to fix itself and that he will not do anything with the economy. He gets a lot of criticism for this, but in fact, this was the general thinking of the day. It was only till after several years of not doing anything that leaders in the United States, as well as in Britain and France, are going to realize that this isn't going to work. So, in the last year or so of President Hoover's presidency, he is going to apply $2.25 billion for public works projects. Now, the person who gets the most fame during the Great Depression is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's going to be elected in 1933, and he's going to be famous for what is called the New Deal program. The idea behind this was to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Now, President Roosevelt is going to get a lot of legislation passed, and the reason for that is you had a lot of freshman congressmen coming into Congress. They really didn't know how to fix the problem. They were voted in because most of the people voted in the other guy in Congress. So we have a bunch of new people, new congressmen who didn't have much experience, and they pretty much said anything to whatever President Roosevelt said. And so that's why you're going to see a lot of different legislation passed and be one of the busiest congressional passing of laws. So they're going to pass unemployment insurance, old age insurance, minimum wage insurance, conservation of natural resources, and restriction on child labor. Basically, what you have is the start of Social Security and unemployment and minimum wage, which still is in use today in the United States. He is also going to have the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933. This means that the United States will regulate banking transactions, but they're also going to have what comes soon after, the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, which forms the FDIC, which ensures individual deposits up to $5,000. Keep in mind, $5,000 in 1933 is a lot of money. Today, it's been bumped up to $250,000. Also, President Roosevelt is going to have fireside chats. What these fireside chats are is just a radio dialogue, basically reassuring the Americans and detailing his plans. This boosts the confidence of the American people in the president and the government and what they're doing and what they're trying to do. So as a result, this stabilizes certainly American politics a bit better than what it was in other regions. Now, just a couple additional acts that were passed: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This is going to employ about 3 million people in public works projects, meaning reforestation, firefighting, flood control, swamp drainage, and pretty much anything else that the government can think of to put these people to work. They were required to send their money home to their families. The government was going to feed and house these 3 million men involved in the CCC, and so that money is going to be used by the families to buy food and other products back home, so spreading the wealth a little bit. He's also going to start the Public Works Administration, be $4 billion in public works projects, dams, highways, and bridges. And he is also going to have the 21st Amendment repealed, meaning that Americans can now drink alcohol legally. Why it became illegal? Part of it is because of anti-German sentiment during World War I and certainly afterwards. Beer was seen as a symbol of Germany, and so part of that was anti-German sentiment, but also there was the temperance movement that became very popular, where men were spending all their money on alcohol after work, during work, coming home, and being rowdy and not too pleasant. That's going to be repealed. All right. So eventually, the Great Depression is going to decline in the United States, as well as abroad in Europe. In the early 1930s, Britain and France are going to pretty much have the same sort of plan the United States does. They are going to have public works projects. The United States is going to recover a little bit, but what happens, which is going to happen just in a few years after these plans are instituted, is you have these ideas of the Germans and the Italians building weapons. But I'll just jump ahead a little bit. We'll certainly address Germany. But as far as the United States and its economy and its recovery, what was going on, just to fast forward to 1935, 36, 37, what was going on in Germany and Italy, they were rearming, violating certainly the Versailles Treaty for Germany. They were building military forces, they were expanding, they were gaining new ground. So wars were being instituted at this time. So for example, in 1935, Italy is going to invade Ethiopia. The United States was very fearful of being involved in another European conflict. And so after World War I, the United States is going to essentially become isolationist. They do not want to have really any dealings with any sort of war parties in Europe. And so they institute the Neutrality Act of 1935. What this means is no loans or sales of goods towards any nations at war. So they will not trade or institute loans to the Italians or Ethiopians. 1936 and 1937, Spain is going to have a war. It's going to be the Spanish Civil War. Eventually, the United States is also going to have a Neutrality Act against Spain, so they will not trade with Spain. This is going to change and shift in 1939. This is going to be the start of World War II. They do have neutrality after 1939. At first, they are not going to trade with either party, but eventually President Roosevelt is going to have this cash and carry policy, essentially meaning if the Europeans can come over, bring their own ships, and buy their products with cash, they will then sell them whatever they need. The problem with this is most European countries don't have a lot of cash, and they're going to ask for loans. And they're going to spend that cash on their own military forces rather than spending money in the United States. So this program is a complete failure. What the Neutrality Acts did was encourage dictators to engage in warfare. The strongest country in the world at this time probably was the United States. And the United States signaled to the rest of the world that they were not going to get involved in any sort of war. They wanted to stay out. And so, as a result, the United States signaling Hitler and Mussolini and Franco that they were not going to have any effect with any of these dictators or wars that they created. This pretty much isolated the United States from the situation, and Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco were confident that France and Britain, for example, were not very powerful and not very ready for war. And so this only encourages the behavior of evil Hitler. Now, the Depression is going to end for Britain and France in 1939 when World War II starts. For the United States, it is going to begin on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. We'll get to all of that when we get to our World War II section. But for the most part, one of the arguments is, did the Great Depression end before World War II? The answer is no. They were getting decreased amounts of unemployment due to production. Certainly in Europe, there was a lot of production on all sides for weapons, planes, tanks, equipment, and other sort of supplies to get ready for war. Certainly Germany was out of this Great Depression since their unemployment was pretty low, since much of their population was involved in the Army, the Air Force, the Navy. They were building weapons, they were mobilizing for war. For the United States, on the other hand, they certainly could have reduced the amount of unemployment by trading with the Italians, the Ethiopians, the Spanish, or the French and the British outright. This could have convinced these powers to not be involved in war. For example, with the Italians' invasion of Ethiopia, the Americans could have sold weapons, modern weapons, to the Ethiopians, but they did not, and that would have at least checked the power of Italy, and vice versa with what happens with Spain and then, of course, Germany. This is a lost opportunity for certainly reducing the unemployment rate as well as increasing cash flow to a lot of the general public. As a result, the Great Depression still continues in the United States much longer than it does in Europe, in part due to war, but also in part due to not having much international trade with the Europeans, who have probably the most disposable income to use. So, a lost opportunity for economic gain and getting out of the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression comes to an end, more or less, during World War II and afterwards, but we'll address that situation at another time. Thank you.